Hey everyone, Cursed Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and here we are at another draft of Jadzi Oracle of Arcavios Twiddle Storm. This deck comes to us again from Lexa, who says that, let's see if I can find that message. Updated version of the Jadzi Twiddle Storm deck. I'm using 10 mana the 10 mana slot as my spot for cards that I only want to cast during the combo. And they put a nice reminder that they don't like the off-color fetches because they think it would be a color identity break. Good reminder. I did remember, I will say, but always a great reminder. I don't want to specify that I did remember because maybe I'll forget in the future. Let's see. As always, this deck list will be in the video description below, as there will also be a link to submit your own decks and a link to skip the line like Lexa did here. Thank you, Lexa, for supporting the channel. It really does mean a lot. It shows that my videos are useful to you guys and that we can continue to grow and look at more decks and improve how we deck build. So, since this is the second draft, what I'm going to say this time, I didn't say last time, it might be helpful to go look at the previous draft of the deck if you wanted to take a look at Jadzi uh, Twiddlestorm and how to use it, because this time we're going to be a little more specific in a few points. And generally, the main point I want to be attacking is these cards that only function during the combo. As I said in the last video, and Lexa was very kind to put aside, we can see here these are the cards that only have use in the combo, and you don't want to prematurely use them at all. So I had suggested in the previous video that we should either put them aside or put our minds to them because it was interfering in our ability to visualize the CMC or the curve of the majority of the deck. When you have a bunch of twiddles, let's say, which are 1 mana spells, just twiddle, I guess, twiddle amongst other spells that are low mana, it gives a bit of a strange impression of what the curve of the deck actually is, because twiddle is not actually a 1 mana spell in the strictest sense. It is a spell you want to cast on a combo turn, so you might imagine it as more of like a card with a higher curve cost because you're casting it later in the game. In the same way, we look at where are we? Unwind or Rewind, which are both spells that are technically free if you think about it, but we still assume them to be 4 mana because that's around when in the game you're going to be casting them. So with that in mind, before we look at the curve, a nice little reminder of who the commander is and what the deck does. So this deck is based off using Twiddle and abilities like Twiddle to untap lands, and we're using lands like Lotus Field, Lotus Vale, and I believe City of Traders technically is positive on mana. Gaia's Cradle is positive on mana. Any spell that produces more than one land, and sorry, any land that produces more than 1 mana. My goodness, my brain. And then we're going to untap it and retap it as many times as we can to generate large amounts of mana. We're going to use that mana to spend on more twiddle effects, and then at the same time to use Jadzi. Jadzi's main ability is whenever you cast a spell, sorry, an instance or sorcery spell, it's got Magecraft, so instance or sorcery, cast it or cast a copy of it, you reveal the top card of your deck. If it's a non-land card, you can cast it by paying 1, and if it is a land, you put it into play. Obviously, the really fun way of doing this is if it is if it is an instant or sorcery on top, because that enables you to then cast that and Jadzi will trigger again, which is really helpful. So that's going to be our main goal, twiddling our lands to generate swaths of mana, playing Jadzi, and then using the mana that we've accumulated to cast spells that trigger Jadzi to cast more spells and go on until we hit our payoffs. So now that we have that out of the way, let's take a look at our curve once again and see what we can kind of look at. And I think the curve looks really, really nice. I think it's kind of strange that these numbers are so low when you look at it without looking at the 10 drop section, but it does give you a nice kind of slice of the direction of this deck, with one being the most the column with the most cards, obviously, and then as we go on, it kind of trickles out. So the curve itself is rather good. But this brings us to another idea, and I think this idea is kind of worth considering because, to be honest, I don't have a clear answer. And the idea is this. If we look at our deck has 100 cards, and we come down here and we look at the 10 drop section, we can see there's 16 spells with mana value 10, and there's 4 permanents with mana value 10. What that neatly does, as we can see here as well, is add up to 20. As we know, we start with a 100-card deck. So due to the very nice math, we can quickly see that, hey, 20% of our deck is our combo. So now that we have the math, the question becomes, is that an appropriate amount of cards for a deck like this? And that's a tricky question, right? Because, like I said, I don't really have the answer, but I want to take a moment so that I can give you my reasoning and my thinking, and maybe that can help you figure out what is right for you. So the first thing I think about is when we look at a commander deck, sometimes we can break down the building blocks of the deck as packages. For example, a card draw package, or a board wipe package, or a enabler package or ramp package. You know, they're kind of arbitrarily named. Depending on whatever your deck is, you can make these packages wherever you want. If you're playing aristocrats, for example, you would probably want a blood artist package, and if you and a sacrifice package as well, right? Now, these aren't hard and fast rules. This is just a tool we can use to kind of break down a deck and try to build it in a correct way. But it's a really functional tool because it simplifies the deck building process, and it also enables us at a glance to be able to see the functions of a deck. Now, how big are these packages? Well, once again, they're kind of arbitrary, but I think commonly anywhere between 6 to 12 cards would constitute a package. There are a few exceptions. For example, board clears tend to be under 4 board clears unless you're a very heavy control deck or playing a deck that benefits from board clears. In the same way that you probably, outside of really high powered deck, probably don't want to play more than 6 tutor spells. But for most kind of packages, I would say 6 to 12 is around what you want. So here we have about 20, right? And this package can also be broken down a little more, right? We can break it down to twiddle effects. So we can look at twiddle, twitch, a bunch of these creatures that are particularly useful, and then untappers such as Cloud of Fairies, and then we can also go into finishers or payoffs such as Chatterstorm, both of the finales, Ave, Mind's Desire, let's see, Temporal Fissure. I don't want to go through all of them, Brain Freeze for sure, but you're getting the idea here. For example, even Aetherflux Reservoir, I think could fit into that section. And I think the trick here is some of these cards are enablers like Aetherflux Reservoir that we don't mind casting early because it's just going to give us a nice passive boost, or Kiyora's Follower, who also just gives us a nice mana ramp as we move on, but are both kind of instrumental into the combo. Now, I think there's also a few cards that I would maybe disagree with a little bit. Cards like Pour Over the Pages, Finale of Revelation, and I think even Frantic Search are cards that you will probably still cast, even if you're not going off, because they do help you set up the combo. So, though I like what you've done here, Lexa, I think it's not 100% perfect, and I think that's fine. This is just a loose idea that a fifth of our deck is our combo. So when we're thinking about this, if we split these 10 cards into maybe two packages of 10, maybe we don't have too much of a problem, but it still does feel a bit high, right? It does feel a little high for the number of cards that are just kind of, I'm going to quote unquote, off limits for your gameplay, right? These 20 cards you don't want to cast until you're going off. So like I said, if I try to put on the packages approach, it feels a bit big, like 20 cards seems a lot. So let's put another approach onto this. Well, this is 20% of your deck. I believe that should have a relatively equal percentage of how much of the game they represent. It might be a bit clumsy. Let me try to rephrase that. When we play regular non-EDH Magic, we have the option of going up to 4 copies of a card, and we increase the number of copies for how often we want to see that card in play, right? Because in a lot of other formats, we don't play tutors, we don't have commanders to get cards out of our deck into our hand. So generally, the amount that they exist is how often we're going to see them. And we generally want the correlation between how often we see them to be direct, right? If we're putting a lot of a card, we want to see a lot of it. And we want to have that card appear at that percentage of the game. So if I'm putting 4 Thoughtseize into a deck, I want Thoughtseize throughout the entire game, if that makes sense. All that to say is there's no way in a 60 card deck that one card is 20% of the deck. What would that be? That would be 6? No, it'd be 12, right? 5% of a deck is 12. That feels right. Yes, that is right. So that's 3 whole full 4 of copies of a card. So here, when we're seeing this, it already also feels like a lot. When we think about combo decks in 60 card formats, we're thinking of finishers take up a very small portion of them, especially when you can go through the entire deck at such a high rate, thinking about Storm. Okay, all that to say that I think if we apply a rule of looking at 60 card decks for a bit of a hint of how many cards we're supposed to have here, the numbers still seem to be a bit high. But we're going to go back to, I kind of got off track there, so we're going to go back to the idea I was just saying, where this is 20% of the deck. What percentage of the games you play with this deck are you enacting the combo? Right? I know this is kind of a weird way of looking at it, but think about this. Let's say the game goes 10 rounds, 10 turns. You go 10 turns and then you win. How many of those turns are you using these cards? Well, ideally, it's going to be 1 turn, right? You don't really want to do this whole thing twice. And so you kind of, if it's 2 turns you're doing this, that's 20% of the game. If it's 1 turn, that's 10% of the game. But let's cut that down. What if we have 6 turns? How many turns do you want to be using this combo? Once again, most likely just that final turn or just once. You want to put yourself into a situation where you're immediately winning on that turn, or, or you've set yourself up that the next turn with Chatterstorm, you've got like a million squirrels, so you're going to win and you don't need to start comboing off again. So, you see, this is why I'm not very good at math. I'm trying to find a way to explain my feelings, and it's hard to do in numbers because I am not a numbers person. What I will say is I do feel like we're a bit high, right? I think you want to get closer to 10% of these cards. And I think there's a few things to think about when I suggest this. I think one of the situations of the deck is that we have quite a few finishers. And I think we're playing more finishers than I would like. And that's the place I'd like to attack this. So let's see our finishers, right? Aev Progenitor Ooze is a creature with Storm that every single time you have the storm trigger for Ave, you get a bigger ooze. So it starts at the first one's 2, the next one's 3, the next one's 4, etc., etc. And ideally, if you hit like 10 or something, you're going to have pretty much a lethal board for most of your opponents with Summoning Sickness. So that's one of our finishers. Another finisher is Chatterstorm. Chatterstorm is very, very similar to Ave, but it costs less mana and has a less explosive finisher, right? In theory, every single storm will create a 1/1. Now, this is really, really good in 20 life formats where getting to like Storm 6 and you put out 6/1/1 squirrels, you're getting ahead very, very quickly. But in Commander, you need to potentially take down about 120, much more realistically, about 100 health from your opponents. And Chatterstorm just does not have the means of getting there. What it does have that I do like is that at its low mana cost, it will trigger Jadzi a number of times. So Shatterstorm acts as both enabler, and finisher. I guess enabler is the right term there. But it is on both sides, so it has a bit of power there. Then we come down to here. Is Finale of Revelation a win condition? No, but Finale of Devastation is. Finale of Devastation, once you pump enough mana into it, will turn all of those squirrels into incredibly powerful creatures. Same thing with Ave, though the main thing you want to gain from this is haste, right? It doesn't give trample now that I think about it, which is a bit troublesome. I always assumed it did, but giving plus X and haste, I think, is particularly strong, enabling all of those squirrels or aves to go hasty, attack, and hopefully defeat all your opponents. Mind's Desire feels like a finisher, but it really isn't. It's just putting you really, really far ahead. You need to flip one of your other finishers in order for Mind's Desire to do anything. Temporal Fissure is not a finisher, but it's very, very close because if the storm count is high enough, you're going to empty all of your opponent's battlefields, including their lands, back into their hands, and they are restarting, whereas you have 14 squirrels to get some attacks in over the next few turns. And also importantly, you're probably in a position to combo again the next turn, or even just get some value plays off of Jadzi, so you're fine. Then coming over here, Brain Freeze is another classic kind of finisher. Brain Freeze often benefits when you can loop infinite spells. Because when you really think about it, Brain Freeze is a lightning bolt to 100 life deck, right? It's 3 cards. Realistically, people will not have 100 cards in deck, but let's assume they have 70 each. That's 240 cards to mill. Oh boy, that's 80 storm count for Brain Freeze to take them all out. You need, for sure, a infinite combo where you are casting and uncasting the same spell over and over again. And though I've looked through this deck a lot, I'm not quite sure if that combo exists where you have in your deck the ability to cast the same spell over and over again. I'm sure it can be in here and I'm just missing it. But I don't see a lot of ways to return the cards back into your hand after you've used them, which is the main way that we repeating, like a buyback card, for example, would be very, and I guess maybe I should find something like that for you. But a buyback card could be very, very useful here because when you have infinite mana, which is very, very doable in a deck like this, you can then translate that infinite mana to infinite casts of a spell and buyback, and then with infinite casts, Brain Freeze will mill out all your opponents. After which, we have Weather the Storm, which isn't really a win condition. It does put you very, very far ahead from conventional damage, but it doesn't win you the game. And so I don't even know if it belongs in this 10 mana slot because there are some times that you just want to cast this after your opponents, cast 2 or 3 spells in the same turn, because gaining 9 to 12 life can put you give you enough of a bunker for 1 or 2 turns to get you ahead. So you don't have to worry about defending or just you know being targeted really quickly. But I have a different spell for that, so let's wait for that, and I'll suggest that. Then our last main, we have one more finisher here that isn't on the list, which is Blue Sun Zenith. Blue Sun Zenith with infinite blue mana will mill out all of your opponent's decks. And technically, no, okay, you can't loop this card around forever because it draws a card before it shuffles itself back in. So even if it's the last card in your deck, you won't be able to draw it, unfortunately. But once again, technically with infinite blue mana, you can mill out all of your opponents. And then finally, Aetherflux Reservoir is our last real Storm finisher, and honestly, in my opinion, the best one, where it has a really good passive ability and it has a very good payoff of dealing 50 damage, which is pretty lethal most of the time. So I think that's good enough. Obviously, as you cast more and more spells, it gets better and better. But if you're going off to any means, like a regular kind of storm off, you're going to definitely be able to defeat all 3 of your opponents as long as you keep gaining life, especially with Weather the Storm, of course. So that was just a quick look at our finishers. Now, I want to suggest maybe we cut down 2 or 3. The one that stands out to me the most is Brain Freeze. I feel like it's the toughest one here to kind of make work without a high enough storm count. Yes, it's possible to mill out one of your opponents and leave the other 2, but I don't think that's particularly what you want to do. So it kind of stands out as a card that is weaker than the other ones by a wide margin. Now, another use of Brain Freeze is to target yourself, but I don't really see enough cards in here that actually would want you to do that. So something I'm just a little hesitant about because it seems like the power level is rather low. I think also, maybe this is just me, Chatterstorm or Ave, I probably wouldn't play both. They do different things, and I think that's relevant. And I think there is an argument to be made for either of them, with Ave being more of a threat that you can just end your turn on, whereas when you don't have Concordant Crossroads, or Chatterstorm being one that triggers Jadzi over and over again. I think either is fine. I would just pick the one. I don't think I'd pick 2. I'd pick both, I should say. All right. I think those are generally my kind of points and my directions. And let me see how are we on time. Perfect. So I have a few suggestions to kind of put of cards that kind of came to mind, but I'm going to be honest, I'm considering this deck most of the way complete. I think this deck is mostly complete. I think there's a few things here and there that we could improve, and a lot of them are going to be the final decisions on the power level this deck is going to settle on, right? Tutors are obviously something that is noticeably missing from the deck. And it's going to be up to you to decide if you want to include them or not, because that will kind of solidify the power level. And to be honest, you're already playing what I would consider the strongest tutor your deck has access to, which is crop rotation. I know sometimes there's this kind of back and forth of whether, ramping or searching for lands is considered tutoring. I would absolutely consider this tutoring. I think crop rotation is an insanely powerful card in your deck because it allows you to, at instant speed, put one of your Lotus Bloom, Lotus Fields, what have you, onto play. Lotus Veil, that's what it is. Put it into play, sacrifice the 3 lands, one for this and the 2 others on trigger, and then start your turn ready to go. This is an immensely powerful card in a deck like this. And if you are able to make peace, and this is not just towards Lecter, this is just something that I think about when people talk to me about tutors quite often. If you're able to make peace with the fact you're playing crop rotation, I think you should be able to make peace with playing Mystic Tutor, right? I think they're very, very similar cards, and I would argue crop rotation is often stronger than Mystic Tutor in a lot of kinds of decks. So just something to think about. The other thing, of course, is we're already playing Force of Will. The next question will be how many other free counterspells you'd like to play. Every single additional free counterspell you play will make the deck stronger on the power level scale. Just remember that and use that knowledge to kind of solidify where the power level should land. You're playing a lot of really strong cards like Gaia's Cradle, Force of Will, Crop Rotation. I think it's reasonable to assume this deck is just going to have a higher power level than most decks. Like this is getting close to what some might say an 8 or a 9, most likely a 9. Once again, those numbers are gibberish. It's just that kind of feeling that we use to kind of describe decks. This is not what I would consider CEDH power, but with tune-ups, it could get to that power level, and maybe that's something to consider is how far you want to lean into that direction. For example, not playing something like Rhystic Starry or Mystic Remora are things you could be considering moving forward. So with that in mind, I have a few cards that I want to suggest that aren't of that really high power level, and I believe, function at this power level that you have already. I've got what I would say 2 defensive cards, maybe 3 defensive cards, depending, and 3 enabling cards. So let's do the defensive cards because they're less interesting, and I'll explain my reasoning on each of them. That's right, I am suggesting Fog. Fog is a kind of card that I believe is somewhat underused and underappreciated. Now, like all of my suggestions today, they're very light suggestions. They're cards I want you to think about because they might not be on your radar, and I think you should be considering them depending on the meta you're playing in and who is out to get you. Remember when I was talking about our favorite card here, where are you? Weather the Storm, and how sometimes you're going to use Weather the Storm to just put yourself far enough on life to kind of survive an extra turn or two. Fog does the same thing. Fog puts you in a position where you are vulnerable to a really big attack, and instead of just, losing or taking a very large attack, you can fog your way through it. One of the things about life totals in Commander is they have the power to inform your opponent's plans for the next few turns. If you are getting close to comboing off and you are at 30 life versus being at 12 life, really does change your opponent's options in dealing with you, right? If your opponents all agree to attack you and defeat you out of the game that way, it incentivizes you to use Fog to kind of put a big damper on that direction. Because then they've invested a big attack on you instead of like holding up removal or instead of, trying to stop you by destroying like counterspelling, or I guess these are all removal, but it does help stop a very narrow attempt to stop you through combat for one turn. And one turn is often what you need, right? Like we said before, this deck combos off once and it should be able to win from there. If your opponents are attacking you for 12 to 24 damage, being able to 1 mana just deal with it is going to be incredibly powerful. There's also situations where your opponents are going to be attacking each other, and you're going to not want to let that happen. I'm not going to name too many specific scenarios, but it's easy to imagine that one of your opponents has a card in play that is stopping another one of your opponents, such as they're playing Rest in Peace versus the Graveyard deck, and though you are somewhat affected by Rest in Peace, you're generally okay with Rest in Peace to play. One of your opponents attacks the Rest in Peace player to get Rest in Peace off the battlefield by defeating the player. Fog is a fantastic way to just say, no, I need that Rest in Peace in play. Leave that in play. That's kind of a niche use, but I think overall, Fog is something worth considering. You're not playing board clears, and Fog sometimes acts as a combat damage board clear, where for one turn cycle, the player with the greatest combat damage is negated from being able to do that. Not suggesting, not withholding, my goodness, not just saying that. Also, we think about creature damage triggers. We think of Ragavan and the like, which need to deal damage in order to trigger. Fog stops those too. Okay, enough about Fog. Fog's really fogged up my brain. Let's talk about Collector Oof. Another defensive card that I think can be run in here. Collector Oof shuts down all activated abilities of artifacts. This includes mana abilities, which we don't see very often on a card that stops artifacts. Sometimes they'll say except for mana abilities. This does. When we look at our artifacts, we have 1, 2, and 3 activated abilities on 5 artifacts. Of these 3 activated abilities, Expedition Map is one you will activate very, very early, and once activated is gone forever. Candelabra is particularly strong, so it is a bit tough to be losing it. It's important to remember that you'll be losing it, but in worst case scenario, you can snap away your Collector Oof if you're going to win and you just need that Candelabra back. Alternatively, sorry, not alternatively, and the last one is Aetherflux Reservoir, which though you do lose the activated ability, you still get the passive ability. And once again, at a certain point, you can just bounce Collector Oof or let Collector Oof die for a number of reasons, like attacking into an opponent or blocking, and then you will have the ability to use the Aetherflux Reservoir yet again. So with that in mind, considering it only stops 5 cards in your entire deck, I think Collector Oof is definitely worth considering. Once again, depending on your meta, this can shut down players completely and demand answers. And depending on the decks they're playing, those answers might not be easy for them to draw into, especially if they're dependent on clues, on treasures. If they aren't a deck with a lot of removal, this card can really, really hold down the fort for a while. Our last defensive spell would be Narset Parter of Veils. I think this is worth considering because Narset's passive is really, really strong and works with cards that you have like Time Spiral and another one that I'm going to suggest. But also, Narset's ability to dig and find you some of your Twiddle cards or some of your payoffs or some of your just general cards to play with is also really, really good. I think being able to just keep Narset in play for a few turns can put you very far ahead while punishing your opponents for just trying to draw cards. I think this one is the one I would suggest the strongest. I think it's pretty easily, a card that is very, very good here. And once again, depending on your meta, but as long as your meta likes drawing cards, Narset will do work. All right, 3 more cards here, and these are more enablers or cards to assist what you're doing that I thought were somewhat worth thinking of. So, our first one here is Echo of Eons. Echo of Eons is Time Spiral, except for you can also flashback it. I want to double check that. I've never actually read Time Spiral. Okay, without the untap. All right, that's fair. It's almost Time Spiral. But the thing I really like about it is that its flashback cost is 3 mana, which is exactly one of your untaps of Lotus Field. So it's like perfectly at the right mana cost for you to use it. I think this card will be really good. Obviously, as I mentioned, it works really well with Narset, but I think it's just good as a second copy of a card that you can use fairly and then use again all in the same turn, considering the large, large amount of mana that your deck produces. I really do like this, and I think this is a card that can be considered. All right, let's get to the weird ones. One of the weird ones is Gaia's Will, or Gaia's Will. So Gaia, yeah. Gaia's Will is really strong here for a number of reasons. One, it is a storm ability. When you cast Gaia's Will, you're able to cast cards from your graveyard at their regular cost, and continue to twiddle, continue to get ahead. A lot of twiddle decks use a type of Underworld Breach card or Yawgmoth's Will or anything like that that enables you to keep playing the same cards over and over to continue going. And I think Gaia's Will does this job really, really well. I think the other thing that's really smart about this is that you can't really cast Gaia's Will. You have to suspend it. Gaia, my goodness, I can't keep it straight. However, Jadzi will let you cast this spell, right? You flip this off the top, you pay 1 mana, you immediately get it. It functions as an alternative casting cost, and therefore or I guess just another way to cast the spell, so you get around the fact that this spell has no mana cost. If you can cast this spell, I think it's pretty realistic for you to win the game if you've already cast a few Twiddles or used a few of your untap abilities. Even just plainly casting your storm spells again, so being able to use Chatterstorm, Gaia's Will, Chatterstorm again, will get you very, very far ahead. But just generally, I think this is just going to be a really, really good card if it works the way I want it to. I don't know if it's always going to work the way I want it to. I think sometimes you're going to suspend it on turn 1, and turn 4 is going to come by, and you're going to have really nothing to play. And I think in those scenarios, it's not going to be as great, but it's something worth considering. One that I keep forgetting to add to the list, Brainstorm. Isn't Brainstorm supposed to be in a deck like this? Like, am I... I don't think I'm misunderstanding this. I think Brainstorm is really, really strong, right? Because it sets up your top cards for Jadzi to be able to, activate them and cast them off the top of your deck. Also, it fixes your hand with 3 cards so that you can order your cards in the correct way so you can keep going. I feel like maybe it's not as good as I think it is because it's not in here already, but Brainstorm feels like a really, really nice include here of a really, really low mana card that's strong in most parts of the game. And I know we're not playing extra fetch lands, but for the fetch lands you do have, the ability to shuffle your deck after casting Brainstorm is incredibly powerful, and so works really, really well. So that was just been on my mind while I've been filming this, but that's up to you to decide. The last one is Giga Drowse. Um, I don't know how much I want to recommend this. I guess it's just on my mind because I wanted a replicate card because I feel like replicate works really, really well with Jadzi because what this card actually says is 2 mana, activate Jadzi, and then basically 2 mana to do it again. Because every time you replicate, it's a copy of the card, and for each of those copies, you get to pay another mana and get the top card. Now, granted, that doesn't include. I'm actually saying this wrong because lands don't cost any mana, so you could actually end up on top, and you can choose, I think, not to use the ability should that. No, because that would just end the cycle, right? Because it doesn't get shuffled away or anything. Yeah, it just stays on top. So with that in mind, Giga Drowse is really interesting to me because it allows you to pour a lot of the mana you've been working with. Like if you just have tons and tons of mana and nothing really to do with it, Giga Drowse lets you to pour it all into Jadzi to just get as many roulette spins as you possibly can to hopefully grab something that allows you to keep going. I'm not sure to what degree this card is good. It doesn't do that much when it's not being played as a combo card, but it does occasionally tap down blockers, attackers, activated abilities you need to keep down, anything like that. So it does have some merit to it. There is that classic thing that if you have like 4 blue mana open and I have 4 lands, you can tap down all my lands on my upkeep, effectively skipping my turn. Skipping a turn with Giga Drowse isn't as good in 4 player as it is in 1 player. Sorry, 1-on-1 in 2 player, but it's still something to be considered. I'm just throwing this out there. I don't know to what degree I really agree with it, but I think it's an interesting card to consider. It is definitely something that will surprise your opponents and earn you cool kid points for sure. All right. That comes to the conclusion of my general opinions on the deck. I don't really think I have much more that I can say. I think the deck is mainly complete. I think I think the next step is a lot of testing. As I suggested before, I think 20% of your deck being cards that can only be used in your combo feels high. I don't know to what degree I'm correct on that. This is one of the hard parts about deck building, is there comes to be a point where you just need to test the deck. And remember, because some people forget this, testing a deck means you're going to have to play this maybe 20, maybe 30 games before you start feeling out whether or not it's the right number. This is not something that you can just shuffle up, play, one night, 3 or 4 games and say, I wasn't really seeing my finishers, so I should probably go up with them, right? This is something you just have to, you'll be able to suss it out over, dozens of games. But that's probably the next step that has to be whether or not you want this percentage of cards that only work in the combo. Then, as I said before, the next step is to consider how much further you want to power up or power down the deck. We are approaching kind of the end of the deck, and so it's going to find itself solidly at a certain mana, like sorry, a power level, and you just need to make sure you're okay with that. Like I said, you are playing really strong tutors like crop rotation. You are playing free counter spells like Force of Will. It's going to be up to you to decide how many more of these types of cards you're going to want to play. And then the last thing, as I mentioned before, I gave some suggestions for a few cards to think about. I don't think you need to overthink these things that I've given you. I think they're just options. In the meantime, the more important parts are figuring out the other aspects of your deck that I've listed. And then later, if you're feeling like these cards are cool, then absolutely give them a try, see how they work. I would say Brainstorm feels like it's a card that's missing in the deck. Narset is another one that I really, really easily would suggest. And then the rest, I'll leave it to you to decide because I will say I want you to think about them. I don't necessarily want to encourage you to play them. I hope this deck assist was helpful. Thank you so much again, Alexa, for helping support the deck. It means a lot. Lex has been sending us a lot of decks and has been very supportive, and I really want to thank you for that because it does mean a lot to the channel and means a lot to me. If you've got another draft or another deck you want to send my way, there is a link in the video description below. And if you want to, like Lexa, bring your deck to the top of the list, there is a link there where you can support the channel and do so. Finally, if you'd like to like, comment, subscribe, do the whole YouTube thing, I would be very, very grateful as it does help the channel quite a bit. The more I look at this deck, the more I'd be afraid to play against it. And I think that's a pretty encouraging sign that it's in the right direction that it wants to be on. So for the next changes, good luck.